Hi there, I'm Sarah and this is My First Quilt, and today I'm going to show you how to make another easy baby quilt. We made a super simple baby quilt in a previous episode where we used 5-inch charm squares and just sewed them all together and put a super soft, cozy cuddle backing on it. Super easy to create, but this time we're going to kick it up a notch. We're going to actually create pieced half square triangle units using triangles, and I've got a nice little template to show you how you can easily cut out your triangles and then the easiest way to sew them together. So this is the finished quilt and it's a lot of fun to play with. I went into my fabric store and pulled just a whole bunch of different fabrics out of 4 main color families. In the instructions they tell you that you've got a purple, a pink, a green, and a blue as your 4 main colorways. And you could play with that color scheme if you want, just as long as you've got those 4 kind of separate groups. And within that, I pulled 6 to 8 different fabrics of each color, and that gives you kind of a scrappy effect, but still looks a little bit organized because of the fact that it's grouped into colors. So you end up with a striped effect on the quilt, and it's a lot of fun to make. Now the instructions for this quilt call for working with fat quarters. And of course, when you're working with a fat quarter, you're working with a piece of fabric that's 18 inches by about 22, depending on the width of the fabric. You could also use actual quarter yards by the full width. A quarter of a yard is 9 inches by the 45. You could do that too. Either way works. That's how I did mine. If you're going to work with the quarter yards of fabrics, just cut off the fold and then you've essentially got the same strips that you would get from a fat quarter. And you'll see what I mean in the instructions. But you start with 6-inch strips of fabric. And again, those are by half the width of the fabric because the fold is cut off. So 6 inches by approximately 22 inches. Now we are going to be working with triangles, and any time that you work with triangles in fabric, you have bias edges involved. Now these are going to be the easiest triangles you've ever worked with because the ruler that I'll show you makes sure that that bias edge stays in the center. It's never on the outside edges of your square, and that's one of the keys to easy triangles. The other thing that will help you is to use a bit of best press. This is a spray starch alternative, and this is just going to stabilize the fibers of the fabric and keep everything nice and crisp for you so that when you're cutting, you're not getting a lot of stretching. Now, people use spray starch all the time, but spray starch alternative is nice because it doesn't leave any sort of a residue on your fabric, and you don't have to worry about any little bugs liking it. So you're just going to give it a nice gentle spray, and then you can press your pieces. And I usually work in groups of pieces as I do this. Maybe I'll lay a whole bunch out on my cutting table, or you could just go ahead and apply the spray starch or the best press to all of your fat quarters before you cut your rectangles out. But you just want to make sure that you get it nice and dry. And if you've already cut, again, as I've said this many times before, make sure that as you're pressing, you're literally pressing. You're not ironing and pushing against the grain of the fabric because that is something that will stretch the fabrics. Now, once you have applied your spray starch and pressed them, and they're nice and flat, I just lost one of my fabrics there, you're going to place them onto your cutting mats, and you can work with 4, maybe 6 fabrics if you're feeling brave. You can work at several at a time, but you want to make sure that all of your raw edges are lined up. So right now I have 3 strips of fabric stacked on top of each other, and I've got this really great little ruler from OmniGrid. I'm going to put it on the gray here so you can kind of see. What's nice about this particular ruler is that it's going to allow us to cut any size triangle that we want. I know that we need a 6-inch finished half square triangle unit, so I have 6-inch strips, and I'm going to use the full size of the ruler, but you have markings for several different sizes of triangles. So if you're not working with a 6-inch triangle, maybe it's a 4-inch. You can align the edges of your fabric on the 4-inch markings on the ruler. The other thing that's really nice about this ruler is that it's got little hash marks right in the tips of the corners, and that is to help to cut off the dog ears or the pointy parts of your triangles, and that's going to make it a lot easier, first of all, to align your triangles, and second of all, to feed them into the sewing machine. When you've got really sharp, pointy edges that you're trying to feed into the machine, sometimes the needle just kind of grabs the pointy edge and drags it down into the machine with it, and then you've got a jam, and it's frustrating. So anytime you can find a triangle ruler like this OmniGrid that cuts off those dog ears for you, it's a huge help and a huge time saver. So once you're ready to cut, we've got a nice straight edge here, but you could align the ruler, and you're matching it up so that all raw edges are together, and I can see I've got a little bit of a shift in my fabric here, so I'm just going to line that up so I get really precise piecing and cutting. That's what makes for a perfect quilt. So I'm going to line up my ruler, and again, this is a 6-inch strip, which gives me the full size of the ruler, and I'm going to make 2 cuts. The first one that I want to do is just to do a little cleanup cut here. So I'm going to turn this so I'm not cutting toward myself and just cut that short edge right off, just like that. So I've got one perfect cut, and I'll just rotate this around really gently so I don't move my ruler. There we go. And then line it up. And now the pointy edge of the ruler is hanging off the edge of my fabric, and I can see that little hash mark is on my cut edge. That's what's going to give me my little helper corner there. Make sure it's nice and straight, and now we're going to cut in the opposite direction. Just like that. And here we have our first 3 triangles. There we go. So now to continue cutting, you're simply going to move your fabric down, and there's not a whole lot of waste here. We're going to rotate the ruler. We can place it right back in the pointy corner and along our first cut edge. And I can see up at the top here that again, I've got the pointy edge of the ruler hanging off the cut edge of my fabric, which will cut those dog ears out for me. And if ever you're nervous about this, you can do a cleanup cut right along this edge, just like we did the first time. And then you're going to cut along the side. And there we have 3 more triangles. And you can just continue doing that until you get through your whole strip. So I'll simply move this forward. We'll place the ruler in this direction, just verifying that my hash marks are in line with the straight edge of the ruler, and give it another cut. And then you would just continue on. And there we go. So it's that simple. So with 6-inch strips, you can cut a lot of triangles really quickly. Like I said, I'll go up to 6 layers of fabrics with no problem cutting them all at once. Now the instructions tell you how many of those triangles need to be in each of your 4 color groups. And then you're ready to start constructing the blocks. So it looks like this whole entire quilt is made of triangles, but we're not actually sewing all those millions of triangles together. We're sewing 2 triangles together to create 1 square, and then we sew all of those squares together in rows to create the entire quilt. So it's a little bit more complicated looking design, but it's really simple sewing. So in your instructions, it'll tell you how many sets of triangles you need to create. You need so many sets that are pink sewn to a green, and so many sets that are pink sewn to a blue. So you want to make sure that you pay attention to those quantities in the instructions as you go, so you don't sew too many triangles or have them in the wrong direction. Now, when you line up your triangles, of course, you want to align them right sides together. So here I have a purple and a pink. And just because of the way that these fabrics were facing when I cut them, mine are aligning perfectly right here. I can see that I've got those little dog ears that cut out. I told you how that was going to be a helper for us. It lines up nice and straight and even in the corner. And I can simply take it to my machine and sew right down the inside edge of my triangle. Again, this is your bias cut edge, so be careful that you don't shift it around a lot. And we're going to stitch that with a 1/4 inch seam. So I've got my favorite 1/4 inch piecing foot on, and I'm ready to stitch. There we go. Now here, move these guys out of the way. I've got my sewn triangles, and I can simply open them up, give a little finger press. Now remember, this is the bias edge, so you don't want to press it really hard. And then give it a press. And that is the first square for my quilt. Now again, one of the best things about using this style of a ruler is that when you're working with it, your bias edge gets sewn right into the middle. So as you are piecing your quilt together, you have your straight of grain edges on all 4 sides of the squares, and it's the squares that you sew together, and that's what's going to keep your fabrics from shifting and becoming crooked. So you've got nice straight of grain edges along all sides of your squares. I've seen a lot of patterns where they have you sew triangles together, 2 squares together, right sides together, along all 4 edges and cut down the center. And it's a little bit dangerous to do it that way because you end up with your bias edges on the outsides of your square, and that can lead to more crookedy sewing. So this is a nice way to do this. Now on the second set of triangles, eventually you're going to find, just based on the triangles that you have left over and which direction your ruler was facing that they were cut, that you'll have some sets where your two cut dog ear edges don't line up. So here I've got the pointy edge of one side of a triangle, and then I've got the dog ear edge on the other. And that's totally fine. It's okay to sew it that way. It still gives you a little bit of help to start because you've got that cut edge. But what I like to do is just to make sure that I shift my two triangles together so that everything's nice and straight. And what I'm looking for here is that the points come together on the back side of the triangle. And then here, where my dog ear is at, my straight raw edges are perfectly even. And if I flip it over, I'll find that I've got the same thing on the other side, where my straight raw edges are perfectly even. And now I'm ready to stitch another half square triangle unit. So again, with my nice even 1/4 inch seam allowance, and there we go. So I've got my second half square triangle unit here, and once again, I'm just going to give it a little press to set, and then I'll open it up, and I've got another fantastic half square triangle unit. So again, if you just take your time as you're cutting those, make sure you keep your ruler nice and straight and you're cutting really straight, line everything up, you end up with absolutely perfect squares as you're sewing. So again, this is just the easiest way to do triangles. I tend to, when I'm working on this, because you've got so many pieces to sew together, I'll stack mine together in the quantities that I need. So if I need 10 pink and green, so pink sewn to green, I'll go ahead and stack my 10 pink and green pieces and just stitch all of those at once and then press them and set them to the side. And then I'll work on my pink and blue and just stitch all of those at once and set them to the side. And that way I can kind of keep it organized and make sure that I've got all the pieces that I need. And from there, you're going to follow the layout diagram in the pattern and just arrange your quilt by color, and you end up creating those beautiful stripes through the triangles. And then you've got a quilt. It's super simple. Now with this particular project, because I had some scrap from those strips that I cut, I sewed those together end to end and gave myself a little scrappy binding. So if you look at the binding on my quilt, you'll see that here's some of the green, a different green, purple. It was just kind of a fun way to use up some of my leftover fabrics, because on a wild quilt like this, I think it's kind of fun to do a binding that's pieced and fun too, instead of just keeping it solid. I also used some of my extra strips and pieced the backing. So you really can use up a lot of the fabrics that you used in the quilt top to complete the rest of the quilt. So there is another super simple baby quilt. I hope you enjoyed watching today. Get out your triangle ruler and start to play. This episode of My First Quilt has been brought to you by Baby Lock, for the love of sewing, OmniGrid, providing quilters with specialty rulers and accessories for over 30 years. Furniture provided by Koala, fine sewing furniture custom built for you.